There once stood a building so terrifying that the locals only spoke of it in whispers in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where pine trees stand close like silent sentinels, and the wind carries voices no one wants to remember. It was known as Thornhill. Thornhill Asylum for Children with Moral Defects. More than 400 children were sent there between 1865 and 1897. The majority never returned. It was a Christian rehabilitation home for troubled youth, according to the paperwork. Unofficially, it developed into one of the post's most effective death machines. South Civil War. Recently discovered church records, medical logs, and sealed correspondences paint an absolutely horrifying picture of what transpired inside Thornhill's chapel-turned-laboratory, which was hidden for more than a century until now. And it's not just a tale of one crazy man that you're about to hear. It's about a profitable industry based on suffering, a family dynasty, and a religious cover. But before we get started, let me say that this story isn't for everyone. If you were here for comfort, it's time to click away. However, you're in the right place if you think that the darkest truths of history should be revealed, regardless of how long they've been hidden. Because Thornhill's shadows are more extensive than you may imagine, please leave a comment before we start and let us know where you're listening from. Let's now return to 1865, when the Civil War had just ended and a distraught and divided nation turned to religion for solace. At that point, the Calderon family welcomed kids who had nowhere else to go. But there was only one path out of those doors. You have to know who constructed Thornhill before you can appreciate its horrors. A few weeks after the Confederate surrender, in the spring of 1865, the Calderon family traveled to Kentucky. The family brought two things with them, led by Reverend Silas Calderon, a former chaplain on the battlefield who is now a child reformer, a plan for institutional salvation, and a message of divine order. In his early 50s, Silas was a tall, hawk-eyed man with a preacher's voice capable of transforming brimstone and fire into lullabies. On the battlefield, he said, he saw visions of a generation of children who had fallen and could only be saved by obedience, discipline, and purification. Temperance Calderon, his wife, was hardly ever seen in public. Although some locals whispered that she had previously been institutionalized herself, others described her as fragile. Their 4 kids weren't at all forgettable. The oldest son, 29-year-old Elias Calderon, was a certified medical professional who has never worked in a real hospital. Rather, he became Thornhill's internal medical examiner, collecting surgical instruments and anatomical texts with what some have called morbid fascination. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was usually about using physical recalibration to purify the soul. Next was 26-year-old Josephine, who is charismatic, soft-spoken, and well known for her charitable endeavors and musical abilities. However, those who survived said she was the most terrifying of everything. During her nighttime sessions, she played piano hymns and told the kids that their cries were evidence that the devil was abandoning them. When Thornhill opened, Nathaniel and Mercy, the twins, were 21 years old. Nathaniel oversaw day-to-day operations, assigning rooms, managing personnel, and keeping an eye on newcomers. Mercy was employed in the reflection wing, a term that concealed its actual use: isolation, malnourishment, and incarceration. Last but not least was Dr. Alban Calderon, a defrocked neurologist from Baltimore with a thorough understanding of 19th century brain mapping phrenology and cognitive obedience therapy, but no official license. He was in charge of what recovered documents came to refer to as the silent chamber. You may be wondering how such a family managed to function in public for more than 30 years. Easy. They wrapped themselves in philanthropy, religion, and patriotism. The Kentucky Orphan Relief Fund appointed Silas as its honorary chaplain. Elias frequently made donations to medical. Supply lines. Devotional poetry was published by Josephine in church newsletters. Additionally, Thornhill was promoted as a haven for lost children and a second chance for those with moral failings. However, once inside, there were only records and no second chances. And those documents, which were kept under wraps until 1972, showed a pattern so cold and methodical that even seasoned FBI archivists are said to have quietly left the room. However, we will eventually access the files. We must first comprehend how the Calderones constructed Thornhill. The building was a machine, not just a hospital. I have a question for you. Have you ever seen a structure that made you uneasy before you even entered? Not possessed by ghosts. Just that. Simply put, it was made for a different kind of worship. Survivors spoke of Thornhill Chapel in this way. Virginia was the source of its gray stone walls. St. Augustine, St. Paul, and most prominently an archangel brandishing a sword over a crying child were depicted in its stained glass windows. Although the chapel had 120 seats, the pews were rarely occupied by more than 10 people. You see, Thornhill was not meant for public worship. It was obedience. The clinic, kitchens, and dorms were constructed after the chapel. Although it was never mentioned in any official report, the building was built with a full basement, according to old blueprints that were discovered in a state archive in 1994. A basement with no emergency exit, no outside access, and, most unsettling of all, 12 tiny, windowless. Each room had narrow drainage trenches, shackles fastened to stone walls, and a secret vent system that could supply either warm air or something much darker. Dr. Alban Calderone's private laboratory was connected to the observation chamber B, a single room at the far end of the subterranean level via a small hallway. Does that sound familiar? This was no different from what we would later witness in locations like Robbinsbrook or Tuskegee, so it should. This only occurred 30 years prior, and to kids. A different version of Thornhill was presented to clergymen, churchgoers, and well-meaning donors. They observed prayer circles, spotless beds, cheerful employees, Josephine playing hymns on the chapel piano, and Silas reading scripture in a kind tone. However, they were never able to see what was behind the altar, because there was a trap door deftly concealed beneath a false dais, behind that velvet curtain and wooden crucifix. The Calderones called this area the penumbra, which is Latin for the edge of shadow, and it was located down a stone stairwell that was always kept locked. You might be wondering how something like this could go on for 30 years without anyone raising an objection. This is the reality. Someone did. While delivering coal in 1873, a young coal worker named Ellis Rowe reported hearing screams from under the chapel. He informed the local sheriff about it. Roro was discovered drowned in Mill Pond Lake the very next week, with gravel in his mouth. It was declared a work accident by the coroner. The matter was resolved. For 18 years, no one reported anything more. Thornhill's architecture wasn't unintentional, it was ceremonial. Every element, including the arrangement of the pews and the ceiling's acoustics, was intended to promote silence rather than salvation. Because nobody could hear what was going on below when the chapel doors were closed and the hymns started to play. And from the beginning, the kids were taught that the basement was a myth to keep them submissive. However, the screams were genuine. If you're interested in comprehending the Calderones, not just what they did, but you have to read their doctrine to understand why they thought it was sacred. The handwritten book, which was locked in a wooden case behind Elias's surgical desk, was the Bible they displayed in public. The Doctrine of Broken Things is its title. It was not released. It was never supposed to be. However, parts of it survived. Charred around the edges but readable. thanks to a fire inspector's report that was found in 1978. And it exposes a theology that has been so perverted that it is unrecognizable. The Calderones think that. Some children were morally broken from birth. They weren't evil or criminals, they were just wrong. Unsouled, they said, offspring of trauma, mental illness, or mixed blood illegitimacy. Children who were incapable of responding to common kindness because they lacked a true spiritual architecture. Silas wrote that suffering calibrated to divine order was the only way to save them. Give that some thought. Despite their religious beliefs, they did not torture children. As a result, they tortured children. According to one passage, the vessel must be. A child's silence is not a sign of trauma, but the beginning of correction. He who screams is still resisting. He who submits becomes clay. They referred to their process as reform through collapse. The cries of the weak are not pain, but purification. A meticulously planned series of isolation, hunger, and cold exposure, followed by structured guidance, which frequently included direct suggestion, induced hallucinations, and restraints. Does that sound familiar? It ought to. Contemporary. It's known as trauma bonding in psychology. Cult leaders refer to it as breaking through. The Calderones, however, referred to it as grace. Thornhill had established an intake program by the early 1870s. Most of the children, who came from overcrowded orphanages or families trying to keep a secret, were transported by train or cart. The same euphemism involuntary placement for moral realignment is used in all of the forms. Within 48 hours, Josephine and Elias assessed each child. They were placed in the communal dorms if they were docile. They were classified as Category 3 and sent below if they resisted, lied, stammered, or flinched. They became non-viables if they attempted to flee. The logs indicate that non-viables were never reassigned, but their fate was never documented. I understand what you're thinking now. Were there no inspections, oversight, or comments from teachers or nurses? They were. However, those who voiced concerns were either institutionalized in one instance or quietly replaced. In 1875, Margaret, a visiting nurse, the Kentucky Board of Mental Health received a letter from Bellamy. The locked basement, the children's condition, and the unidentified smell all worried her. She was committed to St. Jude's Sanatorium in Louisville after receiving a diagnosis of melancholic hysteria 3 weeks later. She starved herself to death there 8 months later. Her complaint was never looked into. This question will keep coming up, so I'll ask you again. How many people turned their heads away knowing? How many people thought when Calderones declared that this was the work of the Lord? Because everything is acceptable once you believe that some kids are better off broken. And everything was in the chapel of Thornhill. Let's talk about numbers, or rather, the lack of them. Official records show that 223 children were admitted to Thornhill Asylum between 1865 and 1897. However, during a quiet review in 1968, state auditors returned to those files and discovered an oddity. The facility was adequately funded. More than 600 rail vouchers and supplies. That represents a difference of almost 400 kids. And things worsen. It was evident from comparing Thornhill's patient logs with the train depot manifest from neighboring Hazard, Kentucky, that at least 142 children arrived between 1870 and 1889, but were never recorded at all. They never received meal rations, beds, or even names in the dormitory rolls. They just disappeared. According to some investigators, they might have passed away from illness. Others suggested a clerical error. However, in 1995, Dr. Helen Marin, a private researcher, discovered something that completely altered the situation. Reverend Silas Calderone gave her access to a forgotten trunk of letters. letters addressed to distant cousins, parish priests, and orphanage administrators. Dozens of handwritten death notices were discovered inside. They were all variations of the same template. We regret to notify you of the child's death while receiving corrective rites. After being sanctified, the body was given back to the planet Earth. We hope that their restoration brings you peace. No reasons for passing away, no burial sites, no dates. But there was only one item with every letter. A page ripped from a child's Bible, a shoe, a hair ribbon, and occasionally a finger bone inside a paper bag. The Calderon seemed to think that these tokens fulfilled the idea of closure. Now consider that. Imagine being a child's only surviving relative who receives a wooden box with a name written in pencil and a blood sample instead of a body or funeral, tucked inside with a stained ribbon. And you were supposed to accept that. Many did so because to question it would be to contest God's word as revealed through individuals such as Silas Calderon. And that wasn't just blasphemy in 19th century Kentucky. Social suicide was what it was. Here's another thing. The kids who were most likely to vanish weren't just underprivileged. They came from unmarried mothers, were black, mixed race, or disabled. They were already deemed disposable by society. They didn't need to be concealed by the Calderons. The community had deleted them already. Perhaps that's why this story is so terrifying. Not just the brutality, but also the ease with which it was permitted. As of right now, there is no official closure, no death certificates, no cemetery verified for Thornhill's missing children, just irregularities in the soil scans behind the chapel. More than 17 rectangular depressions, each about 4 feet long and irregularly spaced. The type of pattern that is not produced by natural erosion. However, that's not the worst of it. Beneath those graves, even more unsettling was discovered by forensic geologists, a burn chamber with stacked, charred wooden beams. We'll go back to that shortly. We must first comprehend how Thornhill evolved into more than a family-run asylum. Because the Calderons found partners in the late 1870s, and they constructed something even more sinister than the chapel. Let's take a moment to change our viewpoint. You may have assumed by now that Thornhill was a singular horror, the result of the perverted beliefs of a single family, tucked away in the Kentucky hills. That's not the whole story, though. Since Reverend Silas Calderon ceased acting alone in 1878, he started writing to a Louisville-based group of doctors, clergymen, businessmen, and even judges who felt that the South had become morally ill after the war. They referred to themselves as the Society for Moral Architecture, and they had a terrifyingly easy mission: to rectify flawed institutions in order to restore the Christian order. Stock. There was no public access to the society. There were no official records that mentioned it. However, we now know that they met at private estates on a quarterly basis, thanks to a set of leaked letters found in the attic of a retired priest in 1986. They gathered funds to support moral havens such as Thornhill, and they established common standards for what constituted sacrificial versus reformable. According to one letter from 1879, it is best to return children who have lost their spiritual memory to their parents because their suffering sanctifies our own shortcomings, as stewards of virtue. The signature was made by Boston phrenology professor Dr. Malcolm Hale, who donated more than $5,000 worth of surgical equipment despite never having personally visited Thornhill. That is about $150,000 in the present day. It also grows darker. The children were treated as data points rather than as patients, as the society started to disseminate the outcomes of Thornhill's interventions: survival rates, resistance breakdown times, and silencing response times. For a total moral eraser, they even had a coded metric. 1. Case 42C, a 9-year-old mulatto girl, collapsed within 72 hours. There was a replicable note next to it. This was no longer theology, systematized cruelty that was funded like a business and supported by doctrine. You might be wondering, how come no one stopped this simple? Because powerful men thought they were constructing something sacred. They believed that the post-bellum world had descended into moral chaos, and they saw themselves as engineers of the soul, and suffering was merely a tool in that world to place an order. You need to be aware of one more detail. Thornhill's chapel was renovated in the winter of 1880, not for expansion but rather to create new listening tunnels and subterranean access shafts to nearby structures. One such structure was a children-run textile workshop, where the typical workday started at 3 in the morning and concluded at dusk, when poor performance led to reassignment to Chamber B, where Mercy Calderon was the only adult staff member ever recorded. We'll return to her shortly, but first I would like to show you the records of a particular child, one whose case defied convention, one who made enough of an impression to be remembered. She was 8 years old and went by Delilah M. Additionally, she concealed a journal inside a shattered hymnal. Sometimes a wall of silence can be broken by a single voice. Delilah M., an 8-year-old girl who moved to Thornhill in the fall of 1881, had that voice. Amazingly, her intake file was kept in the county orphanage logs. Claims that she was the daughter of a black Union soldier and a washerwoman. Her mother had passed away during childbirth. Her father was never found. She was said to be intelligent but erratic. According to the notes, she laughed when shown scripture and refused to pray when asked. Sent straight to the reflection wing, Category 3. Delilah, however, never forgot who she was. She also accomplished something that no one else had during her 2 months inside Thornhill. She put everything in writing during a private demolition project in 2004 on. A historian by the name of Maeve Kennerly found an old, mold-softened hymn book hidden under a floorboard in the north dorm at the Thornhill grounds. At first glance, it appeared to be just regular pages that had swelled with age and had mildew eating away at the spine. However, there were 12 loose pages written in a child's hand, nestled between hymns 141 and 142. The words were still there, but the ink had faded. They weren't complete sentences. They were sufficient to piece together a child's everyday nightmare, even though they weren't dates. These are a few of entries made by Delilah. There was something in the soup today. I kept it a secret. She forced Ruth to sing silently. I counted 4 windows before he said, "The cold makes you clean. I'm tired of clean. There's a room under the church. It eats the loud ones. I wish I didn't have my name." Consider that. This was not a journal. It was a survival code. 100 years later, a map from one forgotten child to whoever might listen. In her last note, Delilah says, "If, I'm probably not going to find this, but Ruth noticed the door open." That implies that someone has heard. I'm hoping it's a woman or God. I hope it's either God or a woman in that final line. That resonated with me because Delilah grasped a concept that the majority of Thornhill's adults did not. If salvation ever arrived there, it would not be through sermons or in robes. It was going to come from the truth, from a witness, from someone who was at last paying attention. The details of Delilah's fate will never be known. Her discharge is not documented. No grave, no death certificate. However, Thornhill submitted a request for a new surgical lamp and a child-sized straight-back chair 1 week after her last recorded entry. The request was granted. Delilah didn't need to be saved, so when people ask why we share these tales and explore the decay at places like Thornhill, I think of her. She had to be remembered. And she is now. There is always a figure that doesn't quite fit in a horror story. Someone who, half remembered, half invented, lingers on the periphery of nightmares. That was the woman in white at Thornhill. She was a pale figure who showed up in the hallways after midnight, and the survivors, who were few, talked about her for years. A silent nurse who occasionally left bandages or water by the kids' cots. Someone who opened doors that were meant to remain locked. She wasn't a ghost, despite what some people claimed. Eleanor Witt was her name, and she was real. Eleanor Witt. Born in 1850, she was the daughter of a midwife and a doctor. During the Civil War, she was among the first women in Kentucky to obtain informal nursing training through underground clinics. Eleanor, who was 24 years old, childless, and cut off from her family due to her refusal to get married again, applied for a custodial position at Thornhill, shortly after Delilah M., in the spring of 1882. Disappeared, she got a job as a lairess. However, nobody was aware of Eleanor's agenda. As you can see, she had grown up hearing rumors about Thornhill. She didn't think reform was necessary, and she had treated kids who had escaped it. She was a believer in truth and in seeing. Eleanor kept her head down for 3 years. She observed, listened, and most importantly, recorded everything, but she never confronted the Calderones or directly challenged Josephine. She sewed notes and symbols into pillow seams using hospital linens. She used chalk inside laundry bins to conceal names and wounds. Additionally, in her cramped, she kept a small bottle marked Mercy's Draft Test 4C, Mercy's Draft, a broken locket belonging to Ruth D., and a hidden satchel with the names of 22 unaccounted children behind the east furnace. Later, in 1902, that phrase would be used in grand jury testimony. The opium tincture sedative in the bottle was laced with mercuric chloride, a drug known to induce organ failure, hallucinations, and silence. Mercy Calderone was more than just a strict disciplinarian. She was conducting a chemical test. Adherence. Eleanor also had evidence. However, there was a single issue. The target would vanish, the child would be reassigned, their name would disappear from the logs, or worse, their room would be empty in the morning each time Eleanor came dangerously close to revealing something. During a delivery transfer in late 1885, Eleanor smuggled 2 kids out of the laundry wing. Exposure claimed one's life. The other, a boy named Anal, arrived at a Jackson County Unitarian mission house. That boy would later testify after growing up and remaining silent for decades. In 1921, the first person who ever treated me like a person and not a sin, according to him, was Eleanor. However, leaks were not tolerated by Thornhill. Eleanor was reported missing within a month. The official account. During a snowstorm, she strayed into the woods and never came back. However, her punch card was stamped 2 days after her alleged disappearance, according to staff records. On December 18, 1885, the last known entry in her secret satchel states, "If I am taken, may someone remember these names. They are actual. They were present. Although God is not here, I was." Her body was never located. However, 112 years later, when replacing the floorboards in the East Wing, they discovered a bundle of blood-stained linens that had been meticulously folded and had the name Delilah stitched in red. The children whispered about Eleanor, and she was too. She wasn't just a ghost, she was something much more dangerous. As a witness, she saw the entire machine without averting her gaze. She disappeared as a result. One room exists that are not shown on any blueprint at Thornhill, not on the 1865 original designs, not on the 1874 update to the fire code, not even in Eleanor Witt's handwritten drawings. There was no marking on it, there was no number on it. However, it was sealed with 2 feet of poured concrete that had been smoothed over and painted to match the surrounding brick rather than a door. For almost a century, it remained silent, and the locals dubbed it the Dead Wing. A restoration team employed by the Kentucky Historical Trust started in 1997, making room for future museum use in the northern hallway. Thornhill was to be transformed into a heritage learning center. When Thomas Ramirez, a demolition worker, struck something hollow behind the wall with his sledgehammer on July 3rd, the plan came to an end. They initially believed it to be a maintenance closet. However, they discovered more than just a room once the concrete was completely removed. The crypt was about 15 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet high. Just a rusted metal hatch with no windows or ventilation. On the ceiling, with iron bars that have been welded shut. Some of the deep scratches on the walls were only inches from the floor. The baseboards had scorch marks on them, and they discovered a stack of 17 pairs of tiny shoes tied together with strips of fabric in the far left corner, under a rusted bucket. However, no bodies were visible. There was only one item in the middle of the floor. Straps still in place, a kid-sized chair bolted to the floor. The room's air samples showed elevated. Traces of mercuric vapor, chloroform, and phenol, all of which are harmful and consistent with early chemical sedation. Investigators discovered barely noticeable nail scratches and words on the back wall. "Give up. Become conscious. Don't go, please." And one word was said again. Ruth. Ruth. Delilah M. had written the same name in her notes. Eleanor had attempted to shield the same child. Correction, Cell 1B was mentioned in internal Thornhill memos that were recovered in 2009, but the room was never labeled. Its application extended morality. Isolation for subjects that are resistant. We now think that this room was created to destroy personalities in order to break down kids who couldn't be changed by sedation, hunger, or prayer. A place where time was the weapon and silence the tool. Why seal it, you ask? Because someone at the top realized what was happening inside Cell 1B couldn't be written off as discipline in 1893, following the covert start of a state investigation into Thornhill's death rates. Thus, they actually buried it, and made no reference to it in any internal or public document. This is the part that most haunts me, though. On tape, a worker claimed to have heard a tapping sound coming from the distant wall on the last day of excavation in 1997. Just steady, not loud or rhythmic. They stopped the excavation and looked for animals, but they couldn't find any. After the cameras were turned on, the sound stopped, but 2 days later, a piece of plaster fell from the wall across from it, exposing a sealed compartment. Within a kid's illustration, charcoal on. Linen, a row of 6 stick figures. 5 were grinning. The 6th was faceless. The identity of that 6th child has not been formally verified. However, there was one named Delilah in the edges of the fabric in almost undetectable red ink. Thornhill was more than just a location by the late 1890s. It was a risk. There were too many unanswered questions, too many missing kids, and too many rumors for the Calderones to handle. However, a whistleblower did not deliver the last blow. It was caused by a flood. During the spring of the Lickstone River overflowed its banks in 1897 due to heavy rains. One of the underground corridors collapsed and pipes burst as water poured into Thornhill's lower levels. It was not mud that emerged. It was rusted medical restraints, pieces of bone, and leftover fabric. Some were still fastened to damaged floorboards. Locals discovered twisted wire, mouth gags, tiny jawbone fragments, and even waterlogged and distorted pieces of child-sized crutches. The grounds were off-limits for 3 days before being quietly reopened. Just a fire, no formal investigation, no press. 2 weeks later, the chapel and dormitory records were mostly destroyed by a fire that began in the West Wing. Lightning strike is the official cause. Unofficially, a number of witnesses claimed to have seen men leaving the building at midnight the previous evening with crates. The Society for Moral Architecture, or SMA, was indicated on the crates. Due to spiritual exhaustion, Reverend Silas Calderon announced his retirement within 2 months. Mercy Calderon vanished from view. According to reports, Josephine Calderon was moved to a care facility. Under the guise of budget cuts, Thornhill was closed by the fall of that year. A coal syndicate purchased the land. The building was abandoned to decay and was forgotten for almost 70 years. Silence, however, did not end the cover-up. A local schoolteacher who attempted to study the ruin in 1902 was committed to an institution due to compulsive delusions. Henry Dunlop, a journalist, wrote an exposé for the Lexington Evening Standard in 1924 that was titled "The Devil Built the Orphan House." Within a year, the publication closed, and Dunlop vanished while visiting Hazard County. His remains were never located. Why such unrelenting repression? Because Thornhill was more than a scandal. It was a blueprint. What happened there wasn't just tolerated, it was replicated in smaller, quieter ways across the country in poorhouses, reform schools, asylums. And to expose Thornhill fully would have meant exposing them all. But despite everything they burned, despite every lie told in the name of God and science and purity, they missed one thing. They missed Delilah's name stitched in red. They missed Eleanor's satchel. They missed the people like you who are still listening. Because now, over 100 years later, the truth is surfacing again. And no flood, no fire, no lie can bury it forever. Most of Thornhill's children never made it out, but a few did. They didn't talk much. They didn't write memoirs or give interviews, but late in their lives when they thought. No one would believe them and no one would care, they spoke, and thanks to a young social worker named Alexis Brandt, we still have their voices. In 1976, Alexis was compiling oral histories from Appalachian elders for the University of Kentucky. She wasn't looking for Thornhill, but one afternoon in a nursing home outside Berea, she interviewed a 90-year-old woman named Marion H. When asked about her childhood, Marion fell silent. Then she said there was a place with no windows and a lady who never blinked. Alexis pressed gently. Marion eventually gave her something more, a song, a slow, droning lullaby sung without rhythm, in a cracked voice. Be still, or the angel will cry. Don't speak, or the silence will die. No mother, no father, no morning, no light. Just God in the hallway turning out the night. The words matched a verse found scratched into the walls of Chamber B. That was the beginning. Over the next 18 months, Alexis found 4 other elders who referenced a place called the Hill, or the Gray House. They all had identical scars on their wrists, light sensitivity, and near total memory loss before age 10. But when shown a photo of Thornhill's chapel, they cried every time. One of them, Benny K., said he remembered being locked in a cold box with red lights. He drew pictures of an iron chair with belts. He remembered a girl named Laya, who sang to him through a wall. Another sister, Thomasina, who had joined a convent later in life, whispered, "We weren't children, we were practice." These survivors were never given reparations. They were never listed in official Thornhill records, but their memories align detail by detail with recovered documents, chemical inventories, and architectural scans. They are proof, living, breathing proof, that what happened at Thornhill was real, and that no amount of time, no amount of concrete can erase what a body remembers. Alexis Brandt compiled all her interviews into a private archive. She tried to publish. No press outlet would touch it. But she left behind a quote in her field journal that haunts me to this day. They didn't just silence children, They taught them to forget. But memory is a kind of ghost, too. And ghosts don't stay quiet forever. So, if you ever hear someone humming that strange lullaby, if you meet an elder who flinches at church bells, or if you see a scar that looks too small for an accident, listen, because there are still survivors among us, and they remember more than we ever allowed them to say. For over a century, Eleanor Witt's fate remained a mystery. We had her satchel. We had the whispers. We had the stains and scraps and names she tried to preserve. But we didn't have her voice until 2022. During a structural stabilization project at the crumbling remains of Thornhill's East Wing, workers discovered a hollow space behind a false support column. Inside was a rusted metal box. In it, a broken pen, a locket containing 2 children's teeth, and a bundle of pages scorched along the edges, written in a tight, shaking hand. It was Eleanor's final journal dated between October and December of 1885, the last 3 months of her life. What she wrote was not just documentation. It was confession not of guilt, but of helplessness and clarity. Here are excerpts from those final pages. October 19th, 1885. Ruth has stopped speaking, not from silence but from absence. I touch her shoulder and she blinks like I'm not real. They call it mercy. I call it subtraction. Nov 2, 1885. I saw Josephine kneel beside Delilah's, caught and whisper, "It's almost over." I do not believe she meant the night. Nov 27th, 1885. They tested a new serum yesterday. One child vomited black and didn't stop. I washed it away with my hands. I don't know her name. I don't know my own anymore. Deck 3, 1885. I tried to leave. The gates were unlocked. But something in me said, if I leave, they win. I turned back, and then the final page. Deck 18, 1885. If anyone finds this, please believe what the children say. They have no power, no voice, no weight in the world, but they carry the truth on their skin and in their eyes. They are not defective, they are not broken. They were made into silence piece by piece, and silence is the easiest lie to believe. Do not believe it. My name was Eleanor Witt. I was here, they were here, please remember us. That journal now rests in a temperature-controlled vault at the Kentucky State Archive. It is not on public display. You must file a request to view it. You'll be asked not to photograph it, but it is real. And so was she. Thornhill is gone. The structure collapsed during a storm in 2003. Most of what remained was buried under earth and legal indifference. But stories are harder to bury, especially the ones whispered behind closed doors, scratched into wood, stitched into cloth, and passed down in lullabies nobody wants to remember singing. So now that you've heard this story, what will you do with it? Will you shut the tab and move on? Or will you tell someone, repeat a name? Delilah, Eleanor, Ruth, Anel, Marion, Laya, because sometimes the only justice left is memory, and now you carry.